Hello everyone. Breathing happens automatically, but the system behind it is remarkably complex. Each breath is regulated by an intricate network of chemoreceptors, neural circuits, and feedback loops that tightly control your carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH. I recently came across Dr. West's excellent lecture series based on his textbook of respiratory physiology on YouTube, and I strongly recommend you to watch them. The links are in description below. To help you get started, I created this short AI-generated summary that introduces this fascinating topic, how the body controls ventilation.
Now, before we get started, just a quick note. This is a summary of Dr. West's fantastic lecture on the control of ventilation. Dr. West has a whole series of lectures that are absolutely worth your time, and I'd really encourage you to watch them. You'll find the link in the description below. Okay, so first up, let's get that 30,000-foot view. The whole point of this entire system is to regulate alveolar ventilation. Why? To keep our arterial blood gases rock steady, perfectly matching gas exchange to whatever our body's metabolic rate is at that very moment. This number right here, this just says it all. 3 millimeters of mercury. That's it. That's the typical maximum wiggle room for your arterial PCO2 over a full 24-hour day. Whether you're sleeping, walking, or running, it stays within this tiny window. It just goes to show you what a high-gain, incredibly responsive system we're dealing with. So how does it pull this off? Well, it operates as a classic negative feedback loop. It's actually pretty elegant. Let's say your PCO2 starts to creep up. Step 1, the sensors, which we'll talk about, detect this change. Step 2, they send an urgent message to the central controller in the brainstem. Step 3, the controller processes this and immediately tells the effectors, your respiratory muscles, to get to work and increase ventilation. And step 4, as you breathe more, you blow off more CO2, the change gets corrected, and things go back to normal. Simple and incredibly effective. All right, so let's pop the hood and look at the actual hardware of this system. We're going to examine the command center, the central controller in the brainstem, and the muscles that actually do the heavy lifting, the effectors. Okay, so the command center is located in the medulla and the pons. In the medulla, you have the dorsal respiratory group, which is mostly inspiratory neurons. Ventral group has both inspiratory and expiratory neurons, and it really gets involved when you need active expiration, like during exercise. And then there's the pre-Boatzinker complex. This was a huge discovery. We now believe it's the primary pacemaker, the thing that generates the basic rhythm of breathing. And sitting just above that in the pons, you have the apneistic center, which tends to be excitatory, and the pneumataxic center, which helps fine-tune things by sending inhibitory signals to help shut off inspiration. And of course, there's the brawn of the operation, the effectors. These are the muscles you know well, the diaphragm, the intercostals, the abdominals. They are the final common pathway, faithfully carrying out the orders that come down from the brainstem to actually move air. Now let's talk about the intelligence network, the spies of the system, if you will. These are the chemoreceptors. Their whole job is to constantly monitor our internal chemical environment and feed that critical information back to headquarters. So what is a chemoreceptor, really? At its core, it's just a piece of specialized tissue that can translate a chemical signal, like a change in CO2, O2, or pH, into a neural impulse that the brain can actually understand and respond to. Now, we have two main types of these sensors, and they're quite different. The central chemoreceptors are right there on the ventral surface of the medulla. They're the absolute main drivers of our response to CO2. But they don't sense CO2 directly. They sense changes in the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid. On the other hand, you have the peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies. Think of these as our first line of defense against low oxygen. Their primary stimulus is a low arterial PO2. They're also much faster to respond. This mechanism here is just beautiful. The whole key is the blood-brain barrier. It's pretty stingy about letting charged particles like H+ or bicarbonate through. But molecular CO2, it's lipid-soluble, so it zips right across. So when your arterial PCO2 goes up, CO2 diffuses into the CSF. There, it quickly combines with water to form carbonic acid, which then drops off a proton and lowers the CSF's pH. And it's that change in local H+ concentration that directly tickles the central chemoreceptors. It's an indirect but very powerful system. The peripheral chemoreceptors, especially the carotid bodies, are fascinating little organs. They have one of the highest blood flows per gram of tissue in the entire body. What that means is they are essentially getting a continuous, pure sample of arterial blood. And while their number one job is detecting hypoxemia, they also give us a smaller but very rapid kick to our ventilation in response to high CO2 and acidemia as well. Okay, so we've met all the players. We've got the controller, the effectors, and the sensors. Now let's put it all together and see how the system actually behaves in response to the two big challenges: changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen. So let's start with carbon dioxide. This is our primary minute-to-minute controller. Just look at this relationship. It is incredibly steep and remarkably linear. A tiny increase in PCO2, say from 40 to just 45, is enough to almost double your ventilation. It just shows how exquisitely sensitive this whole system is to even small changes in CO2. Now, the response to hypoxia, it's a completely different story. It is not linear at all. We often call it a hockey stick curve. Look, under normal conditions, when your PO2 is well above 60 millimeters of mercury, there's basically no change in ventilation. This system isn't really doing much. It's a backup system. It only really kicks into high gear as a powerful life-saving measure when you become significantly hypoxemic. So this physiology brings us directly to a hugely important clinical question. Why do we, as clinicians, have to be so careful when we give oxygen to patients with chronic CO2 retention, like someone with severe COPD? This is the classic mechanism of knocking out the hypoxic drive. In a patient who has been living with high CO2 for a long time, their kidneys compensate by retaining bicarbonate. That bicarb gets into the CSF and buffers the pH, which makes the central chemoreceptors less sensitive to CO2. So what happens? Their main stimulus to breathe actually shifts over to the peripheral chemoreceptors, which are responding to their chronic low oxygen. Now, if we come along and give them high-flow oxygen, we fix the hypoxia. But in doing so, we've just pulled the rug out from under their main drive to breathe, and that can lead to profound hypoventilation and acute respiratory failure. It's a classic iatrogenic trap.
Okay, I'm going to stop here for a moment just to clarify this very important fact, which most of us still believe in. The oxygen-induced hypercapnia in COPD is not because your patient stops breathing. There's nothing called your hypoxic drive is reduced, and that's why these patients get hypercapnic. These guys do become hypercapnic, but the mechanism is very different. There are two major reasons for this. First is your VQ mismatch with oxygen, and the second is your chloride shift and how CO2 is transported. We'll talk about this in some other lecture. So let's continue.
But, for all that we do know, it's humbling to realize there are still some major puzzles. Dr. West himself said he was embarrassed that we still don't have a complete picture of the ventilatory response to exercise. Think about it. During moderate exercise, your ventilation goes way up, but your arterial PCO2 and PO2 stay perfectly normal. So what's the signal? That remains one of the great unsolved questions in physiology. All right, for our final section, let's look at what happens when this elegant system breaks down. This leads to some really common and important clinical problems. Sleep apnea is a perfect example, and it's absolutely critical to be able to distinguish between the two main types. In obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA, the problem is a physical blockage in the airway. The controller is firing just fine. In fact, the patient is making a huge respiratory effort, but it's ineffective because the airway is closed. In central sleep apnea, the problem is the controller itself. The brain simply forgets to send the signal to breathe. There is a complete absence of respiratory effort. Another really interesting pattern you see is periodic breathing, sometimes called Cheyne-Stokes respiration. You can actually see this in perfectly healthy people who go to high altitude, or in patients with conditions like heart failure. What you're seeing is an instability in that feedback loop. The strong hypoxic stimulus drives a period of deep breathing, which then blows off a lot of CO2. That low CO2 removes the drive to breathe, and the patient has an apnea. During the apnea, CO2 builds back up until it hits the threshold to trigger breathing again, and the whole cycle just repeats itself over and over. Thank you for your time. I really hope you found this useful. Medicine is filled with long-standing assumptions, and progress really begins when we start to question them. So treat all sources with a healthy skepticism, and I'd really encourage you to take the time to review Dr. West's book on respiratory physiology. It's a true classic.